This meeting is being recorded.
Cool. So hello, everyone, and welcome. As you may know me, hopefully, that I'm Gervais Johnson, but Jay for short. Some of you are new to our community, and there'll be others joining as we progress today. So our focus in our community over the last several years has been what we call enterprise agile, and it's big companies. What do we got to do to implement agile, have them change, become more of an agile organization and culture? And we've had a lot of great visitors and talks and subject matters. Today is no different. We're very lucky, and I know I'm going to say his name wrong, Tari DePaul. I'm sure he's going to correct when he talks about his name, so please don't repeat what I said. And he's going to talk about something I think, as we all know, is very critical with any agile transformation or any part of agile in the IT world, is DevOps and CI/CD, automating everything in our technology stack and infrastructure, if you like. And I have warm memories of CI/CD when we first began doing it 20-something years ago. And it was a struggle. We didn't have the tools and the knowledge that this gentleman is going to share with us today. I mean, he's still doing this. He's still coding. He's deep in the woods, if you will, helping organizations and teams practically implement this. And I'm sure he's going to share with us some of the ways that he's done that. And I'm sure it's not been an easy journey for some companies and some teams and some organizations, but I think it's critical, especially if you're going to be as agile as you can, be able to change on a dime for a dime, being able to automate and have high quality software. So when I look at his background, he has a very good background in software engineering. He's worked in fintech companies, but he doesn't let that, stop him. He's active in the community. So he's developed an organization called CIT-CON, Continuous Integration and Testing Unconference. He's an active member he's passionate, because when I was reading everything he's done, he's obviously passionate about this. And he thinks it's important and valuable, and he's part of making a difference in the world, which is amazing. Very few people do that, really, if you think about it, right? So we're very lucky to have him here so he can share his experiences and hopefully educate us. So on to you, Mr. DePaul.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Right, now, so this presentation is not that technical, just one technical slide in the presentation. It's really a story about change. So my name is Thierry, and I'm now in Ghent in Belgium. It's 9 p.m. All right, let's go. And for some reason this doesn't work. All right, so I'm going to share with you the journey that 15 teams inside a Belgian federal agency went through in order to achieve continuous delivery. All 15 teams were working on this single central, huge, very old monolith. Now, I'm going to pick the words of Woody Searle, who once said, so I'm not here to tell you whether you should do this or not. So I'm going to share something that worked for these 15 teams. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to repeat this again. However, I see a lot of good in what we did, and that's why I am sharing this with you. So each of these 15 teams consists of analysts, test engineers, and software engineers. And on the side, there were a bunch of transversal support teams involved in the journey, like architects and DBAs and build and release engineers and the infrastructure and operations engineers. Now the monolith is 15 years old. It's written in Java using the AGB technology. It's running inside a single JBoss application server using one single big fat Oracle database. And everything is running inside the private cloud of the Belgian Federal Administration. Now, that monolith is actually very important for the agency. It's the single piece of software that runs the whole business of the agency and that serves 11 million Belgian citizens. The agency had 3 to 4 major releases planned per year, and these major releases were a very big deal. So whenever a major release came near, the stress was rising, all development stopped for weeks of code freeze, during which you had rooms full of users in test sessions where they did manual testing, making sure functionality worked and that no new regressions were introduced. And yet, after each and every release, a series of urgent hotfixes had to be applied into production. In 2017, they had 3 major releases. And as it often happens when releasing is painful and difficult, well, organizations tend to do them less often. And so in 2018, there were only 2 major releases. Now, inside the agency, there were plenty of people that were not too happy with these major releases. And one of them were the domain experts, so the people sitting in between the business and IT. They wanted to see features released more often into production so that they got feedback sooner on how the features were used and if the features were actually being used. Now, late 2017, a handful of people came together to discuss the matter. So how can we get rid of those major releases? But they soon realized that wouldn't be too easy and that they needed management support. Now, luckily, management was quite favorable to the idea, but before that they would approve to remove those major releases, they first wanted a business case. And so they started evaluating the effort of one major release, and the outcome was quite surprising. So every major release had a deployment lead time, so that is from code freeze until production, of 28 days, during which they consumed 334 person days. Yeah, quite a lot, isn't it? So with that, the case was made. Management approved the project of improving the release process. And so early September 2018, the agency got in touch with me with the question, can you help us achieve continuous delivery with fortnightly release cycles by the end of December 2018? Giving us a little 4 months to achieve that. So you can imagine my surprise. So in my humble career, I have never seen an organization that big making the shift to continuous delivery that quickly. But they came to me. Right. Now, this was going to be my very first experience working with 15 teams. So before that, I had an experience working with an organization with 7 teams distributed over Belgium and India. I wasn't too happy with the outcomes, but well, the organization seems to be happy because they came back for another department. And before that, well, I mainly worked with single teams, which is quite simple and easy. So I needed something. I needed a plan or a structure to help me move forward. And I didn't want to use maturity models, as I have often seen used in digital transformations, because, well, maturity models are fundamentally flawed. They assume improvement is linear, context-free, and repeatable amongst teams and organizations. They define a static level of technological and organizational change, and they focus on arriving at a finished mature state. And once they are there, they call it done. And so inevitably, you end up with the classic digital transformation project that has a start date and an end date, where we all know that the digital transformation is never really finished. Therefore, we should focus on achieving capabilities and outcomes and adopt a continuous improvement framework. Therefore, I wanted to try the Improvement Kata. Now, at the same time, my friend, Steve Smith, who was finishing his book, Measuring Continuous Delivery, wherein he explains how an organization can measure the adoption of continuous delivery. And the funny thing was that Steve was also playing with the Improvement Kata, but he extended this with theory of constraints applied to the IT delivery process to identify the bottlenecks inside the delivery process. And so to identify the steps most likely to be improved. Now, whenever I suggested this way of working to potential clients, well, most of the time I got silence at the other side. And once I got the reaction, but this is going to impact the whole delivery process. Well, yes, of course it will. But this time it was different. I was lucky. My contact at the agency was the internal agile coach with a strong lean and Kanban background. And he really liked the idea of running experiments and having data-driven decisions. However, during the journey, I learned that IT management was not very amused by the approach. They wanted a roadmap, which I couldn't give them because, well, every organization is unique. So you cannot just repeat what you did in one organization in another organization. So the first thing we did was to set up a core team who would lead the adoption of continuous delivery. And the reason for that was very simple. So it wasn't that I was going to arrive at the agency with an army of coaches. It was just going to be me. And so it was impossible for me to be in constant contact with those 15 teams. So I was going to interact with the core team, and then the core team would then interact with the 15 teams. Now, building the core team was pretty simple. The internal agile coach just sent out an email to the whole IT organization, inviting everyone having enough motivation, interest, and background information about the system to participate. And so we ended with 20 people representing the software engineers, the test engineers, and the analysts from the various teams. And then we also had an architect, and we had a build engineer, and we had a release engineer. Unfortunately, we never saw the DBAs, neither the infrastructure and operations engineers around the table, although there were quite some problems in that area. I will mention them later. So investing in the practices that make continuous delivery is actually very, very valuable. And this has been confirmed by the academic research done by Dr. Nicole Forsgren and by the book Accelerate, also by Dr. Nicole Forsgren and friends, where Nicole found out that, well, adopting continuous delivery will improve your IT delivery process. And in turn, together with the adoption of lean product management and a generative organizational culture, it will improve the organizational performance, like really money-wise, turnover, market share. Now, continuous delivery is actually a holistic approach to achieving the right speed and the right stability for your IT delivery process in order to satisfy market demand. So it is not just about speed, as many tend to think. It is really and mostly about stability. So you need the stability in order to improve speed, because the stability will prevent rework. And you need the speed in order to improve stability, because the speed will give you fast feedback that will allow you to improve stability. But to improve stability and speed, well, you need to apply a large number of technological and organizational changes to your organization. And you need to apply these changes to the unique circumstances and the unique constraints of your organization. And this is what makes the adoption of continuous delivery so difficult and so hard. So it starts with this list of technological changes that you will have to apply in order to achieve continuous delivery. Now, all of these changes are difficult, but all of these changes are very valuable because each on their own are an enabler of continuous delivery. So let's pick one. Let's pick database migrations. So having the database aligned with the application was one of the problems the agency mentioned when they got in touch with me. Now, on its own, implementing database migrations is pretty simple. It's just picking a tool and off you go, as long as you understand that a database schema is the result of the sum of lots of incremental schema changes. But in this case, the problem was more organizational. So database changes were managed and applied by DBAs, but the DBAs were sitting in a different department from those 15 teams and were reporting to a different line manager, obviously creating the necessary communication overhead. And in addition, only the DBAs were allowed to maintain and execute the database code. So from time to time, it happened that a DB script was not executed prior to go to production. Whoops. Now, this problem never really got solved during those 4 months. So we had to wait for a crisis 3 months later in March 2019 to finally get to a better solution. Not yet how it should be, but already an improvement. So adopting database migrations will improve your stability, and inevitably, well, it will improve speed because it will reduce your rework. Now, on top of those technological changes, there is a whole bunch of organizational changes to adopt, which are far more time-consuming and far more challenging, but also far more valuable than the technological changes. So let's pick one. Conway's law alignment. So Conway's law says any organization is constrained to design systems that copy the communication structures of the organization. So as I've already mentioned with the database migrations, the 15 teams were not in charge of the database. Only the DBAs were allowed to make database changes. And the DBAs were not acting as coaches for the development teams. So in the end, this resulted in lots of communication overhead, causing stability problems. Now, implementing Conway's law alignment is actually very difficult and very challenging. But once you get there, it makes a huge difference for the stability of your IT services. That's why there is a whole book on it, team topologies. Now, your organization is this complex adaptive system in which every individual only has a limited amount of information and where cause and effect of any event can only be established in retrospect. So where do you start? Do you start improving speed or do you start improving stability? Which change should you do first? Which change should you do next? Which change will work in your context and which change will not work in your context? So in order to move forward in these uncertain conditions, well, you need something that helps you with this. And this is where the Improvement Kata comes in. So the Improvement Kata is a continuous improvement framework that helps you in executing and measuring organizational change. So it's a framework for reaching goals in uncertain conditions. It was described by Mike Rotter in his book, Toyota Katas, and it consists of 4 stages that are repeated in cycle. So it starts by defining a direction, a goal that you want to achieve in a far, far future, but that you maybe will never achieve, which is okay. And then you iterate towards that direction using target conditions with a horizon between 1 week and 3 months. So once the direction is set, you analyze your current condition. How does the current process look like? What are the data and facts you have about that process? And then you set a target condition that you want to achieve during a first improvement iteration. It has a set date and a measurable target. It's like an acceptance criteria. Now, during this planning phase, well, the team does not plan how to move to the target condition. It's only during the execution phase that the team runs lots and lots of experiments with technological and organizational changes using the PDCA cycle. So they plan an experiment and an expected outcome. They execute the experiment and collect the data. They then analyze the results and compare against the expected outcome. If successful, they incorporate the change into the baseline. If not, they discard the change and try another experiment. So for the agency, the Kata looked like this. In order to satisfy business demand from the domain experts, the agency realized they would need fortnightly releases. So they had to go from 2 releases a year to 1 release every 2 weeks in order to reach continuous delivery. So the direction was pretty clear. A last major release will happen end of December 2018. And from then on, we will release every fortnight. Now, to analyze the current condition, we were going to use value stream mapping to map the current technology value stream. So the technology value stream are all the steps that are happening from committing code into version control until getting that code deployed into production. Now, for the value stream mapping, we were going to use sticky notes, and we were going to do that as a group where everyone involved in the whole release process was present in the room. Now, the benefit of sticky notes over drawings is that, well, it is more fluid. You can rearrange more easily, and so you can easily iterate over your value stream map. And when you do this in a group, well, what happens? Well, it starts messy, then it gets messier, and then it gets really, really messy. But as people refine the value stream map, with each iteration, they are building on top of the knowledge of each other. Remember, your organization is this complex adaptive system in which every individual has only a limited amount of information. No one in the organization has a complete overview of the whole release process. And so finally, you end up with a value stream map that integrates the knowledge everyone has about the end-to-end IT delivery process. And so we ended up with this technology value stream map for the major release process that takes 6 months, from code commit until production. So during 5 months, features are accumulated. Then we have a 3 weeks code freeze, during which we have rooms full of users in manual test sessions. So this is where the 334 person days start to be consumed. This is also where awareness starts to rise that quality is actually a thing. And then we have a 1 week production deployment. And finally, well, we have champagne, obviously. We've just spent 6 months to get something into production, so we might as well celebrate this, don't we? But it also revealed a second value stream, a much faster batch release process designed for production fixes that happened every fortnight, but that occasionally and increasingly was also used for new functionality. Look at that. How convenient is that? So it's a common anti-pattern in organizations. When the transaction cost of releasing functionality is too high, often a truncated value stream will emerge for production fixes, resulting in the dual value streams anti-pattern. So we have a feature value stream with lead times of months, and we have a fixed value stream with lead times of weeks. Now, although it is an anti-pattern, in this case, it was quite key to the success of this journey, because the batch release process revealed the potential the agency had in adopting continuous delivery. And so from then on, we only focused on this batch release process, and we didn't pay much attention anymore to the major release process. Now, some people were confused by that decision, and they tried to get my attention back to this major release process, saying, why aren't we working on reducing the lead time of the major release process? And then I explained to them, well, look, you are already doing this. You are already releasing every fortnight, but you do this under the radar. Now we are going to make this process visible and make the process more robust. so that we can replace this existing major release process by this fortnightly patch release process. Now, in order to identify the next improvement target, we were going to apply theory of constraints to this patch release process to identify the bottleneck inside the release process. So theory of constraints is a management paradigm introduced by Eliyahu Goldratt in 1984 in his seminal book, The Goal. And the central premise of theory of constraints is every system has a bottleneck. Spending time optimizing anything other than the bottleneck is just an illusion. So if you have a linear system consisting of the steps A, B, and C, and B is your bottleneck, well, losing an hour on B is an hour lost for the whole system. But gaining an hour on A and C is just a mirage. So increasing throughput on A will only result in building more inventory in front of B, and increasing throughput on C will only result in more starvation for C. Now we can apply theory of constraints on the technology value stream because the technology value stream is supposed to be a homogeneous process where every step is deterministic, just like it is in manufacturing. And by applying theory of constraints on our IT delivery process, well, we will be able to find the bottleneck, and so we will be able to find the experiments most likely to succeed. So where is the bottleneck? So to find the bottleneck, I've asked everyone in the room to pick a green sticky note and to try to estimate the duration of each activity inside this batch release process. And then to take a red sticky note and to try to evaluate the failure rate of each of the activities. Now, it doesn't have to be very precise, we just want to have an idea. Interestingly, we discovered that the bottleneck was not the manual testing in pre-production, nor the manual regression testing, as most people, including myself, would have expected. No. The bottleneck was actually the execution of the automated test. Yeah, but wait a minute. The execution of the automated tests only takes 1 to 4 hours, where the manual testing was taking half a day to a day to execute. How can they be the bottleneck? Well, the automated test had a very high failure rate, resulting in lots of rework and re-execution of all of these tests, which adds up to the total lead time. And secondly, the automated tests were executed many times. So each lane represents a version control branch. And so on every merge of the branch, the automated tests had to be re-executed. Now, up until then, every team managed their tests on their own. So each team had their own set of tests, and each team decided on an ad hoc basis whether to execute the tests or not, and which tests were going to be executed and which tests were not going to be executed. So as a result, well, nobody in the organization had a complete overview on how many tests actually existed for this monolith and how stable these tests were. So in order to increase visibility and transparency about these automated tests, well, I suggested as a first experiment, let's implement a deployment pipeline. So a deployment pipeline is a key design pattern in continuous delivery. So it is the automated manifestation of getting software out of version control into the hands of the users. And the purpose of the pipeline is to make the whole process visible to everyone in the organization in order to improve feedback and creating empowered teams. So from now on, for every change to the system, all tests from all teams would be executed. Now, I also suggested to collect some metrics about this deployment pipeline. So the lead time, that is the time since committing code into version control until execution of all the tests, and the failure rate of that deployment pipeline. So we ended up with a lead time of 8 hours and a failure rate of 70%, which is quite high, isn't it? Now, the reason for the very high failure rate was quite diverse. So first of all, automated tests were sitting in a different version control repository from the production code. So ending in having a desynchronization between automated tests and production code. Second, the concept of one test fails, the release candidate was totally new to the organization. Up until then, the organization applied something called test failure analysis. So whenever a test failed, they analyzed the root cause of the failure. If it was caused by a recent change to the code that is exercised by the automated test, then, well, the failure would be, the release candidate would be discarded. But if no recent change was applied to the code exercised by the test, well, the failing test would be accepted, and then the release candidate would be accepted too. Third, test data in the database was never cleaned up before executing the automated test. Fourth, manual testing and automated testing were using the same set of test data in the same environment. And then lastly, lots of tests were depending on third-party services, and those third-party services were not always available when the tests were being executed. So we ended up with the following current condition. We have two value streams, a feature and a fixed value stream. The fixed value stream had a failure rate of 70% and a lead time of 8 hours. Now, the core team decided that the first improvement target would be one of stability improvement. They agreed to reduce the failure rate from 70% to 30% in 1 month's time. Now, because the lead time was 8 hours, they could only execute the deployment pipeline once per day. So this meant that they could have 5 pipeline runs over 1 week. So with a failure rate of 30%, well, they would accept that 2 out of 5 pipeline runs would fail over 1 week. And then the core team started defining experiments. First, implementing a deployment pipeline. This was done, check. They would do a daily evaluation of failing tests to actually start doing something about those failing tests. They would set up a dedicated environment for automated tests. They would recreate the database before running the automated tests, making sure that test data is cleaned up. They would also start investigating how to stop third-party services. And lastly, they wanted to automatically collect lead times, automatically collect the metrics lead time and failure rate from the deployment pipeline in order to create dashboards on the evolution of these metrics. So is the lead time reducing? Is the failure rate reducing? Or are these metrics going up? Now that was for the plan. However, the execution went slightly different. And it's only afterwards that I realized it was actually an example of fear conversations. And these fear conversations helped us mitigate the fear and navigate the difficult conversations we had to have. Now, to be honest, well, it is actually Douglas Quirrell and Jeffrey Fredericks who made me realize that this was an example of fear conversations. So they wrote this book, Agile Conversations, wherein they explain that in order to become a high-performing organization, any organization should adopt 5 types of conversations. And fear conversation is one of those 5 types. So the first fear was one of complexity. When I started helping the agency, the next major release cycle already started since June 2018. We were September, meaning during 2 months, they had the time to accumulate functionality that was planned for the next major release in December. Now, naively, I was hoping there would be a way to gradually migrate the features already implemented from this planned major release towards the fortnightly patch release process. So I wasn't really comfortable with the idea of having this big bang switch between a last major release at the end of December and then adopting fortnightly releases in January. So I wanted to incrementally move away from this major release process towards this fortnightly release process in order to reduce risks. Now, it took me some time to realize this was actually not possible. And the reason for that was, well, a rather complex branching strategy that was in place. And I remember, I think I had one-day conversation with everyone trying to understand how their branching strategy was. So they used something that resembles Git flow. So they have a long-running develop branch and a semi-long-running main branch. Some teams were committing directly to develop. Others were using feature branches, yet others were using team branches. And even other teams would use a combination of feature branches and team branches. But all of these branches were lasting for several weeks or months. Now, during a fortnightly patch release, well, planned fixes and features were cherry-picked from the develop branch to the main branch, resulting in develop deviating more and more from mainline. And so making it almost impossible to merge develop back into the main branch during the major release. So what happened during the major release was, well, the release happened from develop, the main branch was deleted, and a new main branch was created from develop. So moving functionality planned for the next major release towards this batch release cycle was just impossible. So with a big sigh, we agreed to mitigate this complexity by keeping this last major release in December as planned. And in hindsight, I have to admit that it wasn't that big of a risk, because any improvement we've made to this fortnightly release process was immediately implemented in the patch release process. And so it was immediately exercised and tested many times before it was going to replace the major release process. Now, in addition, we also decided that in January, after the last major release, we would then adopt proper Git flow branching strategy. But to be honest, well, I'm not a big fan of any branching strategy whatsoever, but given the context, it totally made sense that they would adopt that. They also promised they would work on reducing the lifetime of their branches and to eventually allow them to migrate towards GitHub Flow, which is a simpler branching strategy. Unfortunately, that did not happen. It didn't work out. The second fear was one of missing key steps. So the long major release process had a number of rituals, like a 3 weeks code freeze, where user acceptance tests and regression testing was happening. There was an all-team go, no-go decision meeting, which was actually a go-go meeting, because, well, nobody dared to say no after 5 months, do they? There was also a pre-production exercise, and then there were automated smoke tests after the release happened in production. Now, to mitigate this fear, we developed compressed versions of each of these rituals that fit into a fortnightly release process, making sure that the value of these rituals was preserved. And so we had a 2 days code freeze for stabilization where business could perform user acceptance tests. There was an all-team go, no-go, but implemented with checkboxes. And so when each team had ticked his checkbox, and when all checkboxes were ticked, well, the release candidate went automatically into production. And we also added the pre-production exercise and the smoke tests in the fortnightly release. Now, meanwhile, the lead time evolved from 8 hours to 4 hours, allowing us to execute the deployment pipeline twice a day. Look at that. So we had a 100% increase in feedback. Number of executed tests also increased, not because teams were suddenly frantically adding new tests. No, it was just because they discovered some tests from their team were missing in the deployment pipeline. However, stability did not improve. We had to wait till late November before we had the very first green deployment pipeline where all tests were green, after which the pipeline went to red again for another 2 weeks. Not very reassuring. Certainly so close to the deadline. The third fear was one of deadlines. So being part of government, the agency had legally mandated deadlines. Missing a deadline was just not an option. How would they be able to hit these hard targets, knowing that a single failing test could block a release? And given the stability of the automated test, well, IT management was really concerned about this. Now, to mitigate this, the core team decided to introduce a manual overrule of the deployment pipeline. So despite a failing pipeline near a hard deadline, the team could choose to still release a bad release candidate and mitigate the risk by introducing sufficient manual testing. Now, I wasn't too happy about that decision because I feared it would remove the pressure to actually do something about the stability of these tests, and that fear got confirmed 6 months later. In August 2019, they were still struggling to have a stable deployment pipeline. On the other hand, it had a benefit of making those overrules visible to the whole organization, because, well, those overrules already happened in the past, but nobody knew it. Now they were going to be recorded, and we would be able to radiate this together with all the problems that goes with it. And the last fear was one of bugs. And this was the biggest concern of IT management. A severe enough issue could land the agency on the front pages of every Belgian newspaper and damage their reputation. And again, given the state of the automated tests, it was a well-founded fear. So many of the tests were flaky and non-deterministic. Re-executing a test in isolation often made it pass to green. So I suggested, well, just delete those flaky tests. They don't have value. They weren't too happy with that suggestion. And in hindsight, I have to say they came with a better mitigation. So their QA experts suggested, well, let's split the tests into sets. We have a set of stable tests. If one of these fail, it blocks the release candidate. And then we have a set of unstable tests, quarantine tests, and these would only be executed at night, once. And if any of these tests would fail, it would never block the release candidate. Now, interestingly, this reduced the lead time of the deployment pipeline from 4 hours to 2 hours. All of a sudden, they could execute the deployment pipeline 4 times a day. Imagine the acceleration and feedback that created. Now, the last major release happened in December 2018, as planned, without major issues, which helped reassure IT management to move forward with the plan. The first fortnightly release was planned on the 3rd week of January, and everyone was holding its breath and expecting a storm of problems. And in fact, it passed quite smoothly, without much problem. It felt like a normal patch release, even though the underlying process changed dramatically. And from then on, well, a release came out every fortnight like clockwork, and it never stopped. And on my first visit after the first fortnightly release, well, I saw smiles all over the place. It was really, well, super nice to see. Everyone was super excited, and nobody had imagined such a change would possibly happen inside that organization. And it just happened. But are fortnightly releases considered to be continuous delivery? Well, continuous delivery has a dynamic success threshold that depends on business needs. So an organization is said to be in a state of continuous delivery when its IT services have the required stability and throughput to satisfy business demand. So in our case, the domain experts were very demanding for shorter release cycles. So with the fortnightly releases, the demand of the domain experts was fulfilled. So yes, they achieved continuous delivery. However, during this journey, I realized it's actually possible to achieve continuous delivery without ever reaching continuous integration. Though it is said that continuous integration is a mandatory prerequisite for adopting continuous delivery. So continuous integration has a static success threshold. So we say that an organization is in a state of continuous integration when everyone in the team commits at least once a day to mainline. And every commit triggers an automated build and execution of the automated test. And whenever the build fails, well, it gets fixed within 10 minutes. Now, clearly, with the metrics we had, well, the agency never reached that success threshold. And so, well, they never achieved continuous integration. Now, is this a good thing? Well, actually, no, it isn't. You won't ever be able to sustain continuous delivery on the long run. You will be operating at a higher level of risk for delayed delivery or production failures than people can actually tolerate. And this will create a higher risk for stress, fatigue, and burnout. Now, many times I was wondering, what am I actually doing here? The improvement process went extremely slow. Experiments did not get implemented. The deployment pipeline did not get more stable. So many times I felt very little, insignificant, and exhausted. And I had the impression this is just going nowhere. And yet it happened in the most unexpected way. And the main reasons, I think, why it worked was that, well, that core team was a very yelled, very motivated team that absolutely wanted to achieve this. The internal agile coach worked really hard in creating a safe environment. The core team communicated a lot inside the IT organization about what was coming, what would change, and what would be expected. The very short deadline created a sense of urgency. And lastly, and not unimportantly, the team took the inertia of the organization at their advantage. They just acted and decided faster than the opposition. Now, the best outcome for the agency was creation of transparency and visibility. So the deployment pipeline made all the existing problems everyone knew about very visible. And once dashboards were in place showing the evolution of lead time and stability, IT management got more and more interested. And it enabled, well, investment in more tech coaching to support the teams. From my side, I've only spent 12 days of my time on this journey, of which, well, 2 days were a kickoff, where we've set up the improvement kata. We did the value stream mapping and then defined the experiments. And and where we also did the theory of constraints to find the bottlenecks. And then this was followed by 1 day of follow-up every week. So my role was really one of guidance and teaching principles and concepts. All the hard work, all the improvement work was done by the agency, so not by me. So thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much. So now we open up for questions. You can raise your hands or just unmic. There's not that many people here, like or so. So just if you have any questions, just go ahead, ask away.
Yes,
Thank you for sharing your story with us. It's really wonderful. Yeah, I really like it. And When you started doing this, do you have any resist from people? And how do you manage that if you have?
Resistance from people. Yeah. No, I didn't have resistance. Well, I didn't feel resistance. I heard there was resistance. But yeah. And this kind of journey, you are really an external person because you are only there once a week. So you don't, and you are only interacting with the motivated people. But they had quite a lot of resistance inside the organization. What they told me is that at a certain point, many teams or some teams were just ignoring the whole exercise until they realized that it was actually going to happen, like somewhere end of November, and then they started to ask for help at the core team, and then well, then it just moved on. But I remember that there has been one key meeting with management somewhere end of November where they planned to cancel the whole thing, and the internal agile coach managed to turn the ship around. But I was not present in that meeting.
Thank you.
So this is Jay. Yeah, so I have a question. So one of the things I'm exploring now, and some of the companies are ready to do this, is chaos engineering. So a lot of times we try to go into the pipeline you did and then the testing, and we say, well, what happens if we, put a bug in there? What happens if I bring up, how will the team react? How will they change and make it work, right? And or change the process they came up with, right? Have you done any of that or thought about any of that?
No. Maturity of the organization is not at that point to start doing exercises with bugs, and just making sure that functionality is there was already challenging.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So any other questions? You can put it in the chat if you want. Gopal's looking at it, or just, unmute now.
Yeah, so let me ask the question, Thierry. You just said, I think, that that inside the agency there was someone. So I missed it. I may have missed the answer to my question, but someone was about to kill the project, and it sounded like about a month short of the turnover from 6 to 9 months or 2 years to 2 weeks. What was the impetus for that? What was the impetus that led them to think, oh, we should kill this rather than go another month and find out that it worked? So there was not a lot of going on. What was going on there?
So the IT organization was managed by 4 managers. There was no director on top of that because he went away and nobody came in place. And so you had a situation where you have 4 managers that are actually rebels. Yeah, we're speaking about public sector. And so, I think there was a little bit of ass coverage, that they were scared that if it goes wrong, well, it will spoil on them. And where the teams saw that, to the contrary, it would simplify their life, and that they would finally move away from struggles and lots of stress and burnout. But the management don't see that. They only see their image, and they were only busy with themselves.
How was the objection overcome?
Yeah, bullshit generation. Really that. So the internal agile coach is really good at generating bullshit, and that worked. I was
So-
not present in the meeting, so I don't know what happened. I just saw mails going back and forth, and I was like, "Oh no, this is going in the wrong direction." And then I arrived on Monday, so I always went on Monday, and then it was like, "Yeah, it's all sorted out. We we move on."
Were the four managers, were they the decision makers who had started, or their boss who had disappeared, the director, who
Yeah.
started this project and brought you in and kicked that whole thing off?
It was really driven by the teams. It was driven by the teams that convinced one of the four managers, and he was behind it. But then, yeah, you had the three others.
So there's a lot of naysaying all the way along from the other.
Yeah.
That sounds tough.
Yeah, well, but as I said, I haven't felt all of that because, yeah, I was really external. And you come once a weekend, and then you start by listening what happened in the past week. What have you tried, or what are all the problems, and what are the next steps?
So you were really dealing, Terry, you were really dealing with the teams and helping them to figure it out. It sounds like maybe the Agile coaches were the ones who are doing ongoing socializing of management
Yes.
to keep them on board, because my guess is they were ready to bail before.
Yeah.
One too. Okay.
So I was not in contact with management, unfortunately. Yeah, I remember one meeting. It was an awkward meeting, but well, where I tried to explain them things.
There are a couple of questions on metrics in the chat by Michael. Michael, it's a small group. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the questions directly, or I can read the questions out, either way. I guess I will be reading the questions. All right, let me read the questions. So the first question from Michael is, were there metrics around user satisfaction? How did this change affect those? And the second question is also about metrics. Were there metrics for success used by domain experts or other parts of the business other than delivery frequency?
No, to both questions, no. There was no metrics around satisfaction, and there were no other metrics than really delivery metrics.
Okay. I do have a question.
There was some kind of a metric there around there were people worried about failure, and failure affects user satisfaction. So there was some kind of connection there.
Yeah, no. So the failure rate was really about how many times tests were failing, automated tests.
But you mentioned they were worried that there are 11 million, I think 11 million users. There are 11 million users. If it didn't go well, there are going to be.
Yeah. So if a bug passed, which the chance was pretty high because there were lots of unstable tests. So once they pass, once they don't pass, and then you don't pay attention anymore. You say, oh yeah, it's this test that is always failing, so we let it go. And so there was a risk that a bug or an important bug could pass and get into production. And IT management was concerned that it would damage the reputation of the agency. But you have to know that in Belgium we have quite some bad experiences with long-running projects that cost quite a lot. I think you had also something like that in the US with a healthcare system, or if it was in the UK. that went awfully wrong. We had something similar with an IT system for our justice, where they worked like 5 years and then cancelled the project.
Yeah, the IRS system had
Yeah,
did a bill that went 5 or 10 years that they ended up canceling.
yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty common in most large companies in the US, I'll tell you, but you know, we've changed some. And that's the whole thing about adopting Agile, where you don't wait 5 years to, you don't take 5 years to build something, and you don't wait 5 years to cancel something, right?
Mhm.
So we're changing slowly.
Yeah, I do have a question, Terry.
Yes.
So I love the slide of the Kata you have,
Sure.
where you talk about the ultimate goal, and then you talk about the baseline, and then the PDCA.
Mhm.
The biggest issue that I face with something like that, I mean, everybody, most people here would face the same thing. You know, there is a valley of despair that the teams and the organization goes through when we go through that, because they don't know what the intermediate milestones are. They don't see the progress, etc. Right? So I'm just wondering, what are some of your lessons learned to get over that kind of stakeholder management and communication through the valley of despair that everybody goes through, all organizations goes through in an implementation like this?
Yeah, there was a bit of that too, because yeah, as you've seen, it has taken long before we had all tests passing to green, and it's the first time I've used the Improvement Kata, and I had hoped we would have multiple improvement targets, and we only had one. Which felt a bit to me as a failure. So I would like to repeat this and see if I manage to get teams to execute more tests fast, well, more experiments in parallel, and so that we can reach targets faster. This was one of the biggest difficulties. It was to get them execute experiments. I remember each time coming in, have you done your experiments? Oh no, we didn't have the time. Oh gosh, what is holding you from doing that? Oh yeah, this and this and this. Okay, well, let's try to unblock that. So, well, I felt most of the time despaired. They didn't really felt despaired, I think.
Yeah, it's usually the stakeholders and the people outside the teams that feel it, because they don't see all the details that go inside the team and the work that they have to do.
Mhm.
How long is usually the test cycle that you went through?
So, well, so execution of automated tests was 8 hours. Well, started at 8 hours and then ended at 2 hours. And then they still had 2 days of manual testing. Well, what they called stabilization was kind of a code for us. But they did also lots of manual testing in between during development. But they still had a stabilization phase that they wanted to keep. Afterwards, because I've stayed another 6 months afterwards, I've tried really hard to get the stabilization phase.
So it's a 2-day PDCA cycle?
What do you call PDCA?
I'm sorry, maybe I'm calling it differently. If you want to pull up that slide, the Kata slide, you had that, the experiment, test, deploy, and then the whole cycle. One more, keep going back. Keep going back, the Kata slide you had.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this one, PDCA cycle.
Oh yeah, the PDCA cycle. Wow. I think there have been 3 months.
Oh,
Yeah,
one
2
cycle
months.
is 3 months long?
Yeah, in this case, it has been 3 months. I would have liked to have it far shorter. And that's why we only had one improvement target, which is a bit disappointing.
Got it.
It is what it is. It's the best they can do, and they'll do better next time, right? You gotta take the gifts when they're given to you, and move on. One thing I do notice: how hard was it? So if you go to the branch strategy that you have, you had the feature branches, and you had the main, because nowadays you hear everything has to go to the main, and that's very hard for most companies to do, especially when you have multiple systems, multiple code bases, and you have to integrate them all, right? Did you run into those issues when you were trying to get them to put everything in the main sooner and shorter branches?
Yeah, well, this was painful, getting them to shorten the lifetime of their branches. I've showed them ways of using feature branching. I remember Pete Hodgson had so Pete Hodgson wrote this long article on feature branching on Martin Fowler's wiki, and then he published examples in JavaScript. I just took those examples and translated them in Java, give them to the team. Well, look, this is how you can do feature toggles. They started incorporating that, but that is after that we did the transition. So
Well, they have to buy into that, because feature flags and feature toggles. So like Google has a whole team of like 40 or 50 people. That's all they do is manage the feature toggles or feature flags. So it is, and it's more than just switches, right? There's code.
Yeah. And you can do a lot of harm when you do it wrong. Well, best example is Night Capital Services that went bankrupt because of a wrong feature flag implementation. So yes.
Could I ask one more question, please? I went to Belgium to join a conference. At that time, European people didn't talk that much. I became talkative, and then I asked the organizer what was happening. Yeah, and the organizer said, "Oh, there are many managers here, and yeah, they didn't want to talk in front of their managers." So when you were running the PDCA circle, and at the check stage, do you have any difficulties to encourage people to speak up, to open their mind? No?
No problem. But there were no managers in the room. It was just the technicians and the agile coach. So it was a safe environment. It worked really well.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you.
Any more questions? Gopal, anything else on the chat?
There are a couple of comments about IRS and things like that, that part of the failure conversation we had. But, there is one question that I see from Michael again. So I may have missed it. Were feature flags rejected due to risk or complexity of managing them?
Yeah, it's not rejected. It's just not knowing how to implement. It's just that. Also for testing, I've did afterwards trainings on test-driven development on legacy code. We use a format that is called Code Retreat, where we do lots of exercises in 45-minute sessions. And yeah, just a thing like dependency injection is already an eye-opener, and how it facilitates testability. So
have you tried Launch Darkly?
I've never tried Launch Darkly. I've never used it.
Yeah,
I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, I was listening to the VP of development there, or product there, and he was talking about in addition to the continuous delivery, he was talking about progressive delivery. That's where they want to take it. With the feature flags and all those things.
Mm-hmm. So in the SaaS offerings of feature flags, you have really two competitors. It's Launch Darkly and Split.io.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, yeah, you're putting something very critical in the hands of a third party. So it's if they are unavailable, your flags are unavailable. It's
No
a
other
trade-off.
questions in the chat window.
All right, so, well, thank you very much for being here. It was very informative, very and very good knowledge to take with us. A lot of people in the chat said it was very good, and some people said they can use it right away and apply it. So, thank you for everyone. I'm going to put this up in our YouTube channel, and I'll send it out to everyone. And if you want, Tari, you can send me the deck, and I'll put that up there too for them to send me a PDF or whatever. And then we can share your knowledge and information around the world.
All
Cool.
right.
Thank you for
everyone.
staying up late, Terry.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Have a beer. Beer
Yeah, I
capital of the world.
I have something.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Where is it?